Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Paradigm Press's new YouTube channel. My name is Sean Ring. I'm the editor of The Rude Awakening, and today I am very happy to be joined by Jeff Deist, the former president of the Mises Institute, the author of A Strange Liberty, which is fantastic, a compilation of all his speeches and writings that he gave while he was president at the Institute. He is now with Monetary Metals, and he is one of the most level-headed people I know, and also one of the nicest guys I know. I'm thrilled to have you, Jeff. Thank you very much for coming.
Good afternoon, Sean. Good to talk to you.
Right. So, going through your book, and rereading a lot of the stuff that I read, I was an avid reader of yours while you were at Mises. Political correctness, and I think it's especially poignant now that we're talking about this. Where has that gotten us now, in light of the current situation with the Middle East?
I think PC is a term that we've been using really since the 90s. And I think it's obsolete. It's been replaced by the term woke, which we'll get to, which I think is broader. But PC was mostly about language. It was an attempt to control our words, spoken and written. So PC really focused on language, and PC gave us things which seem benign, like calling people African Americans instead of blacks, for example. But it also gave us the beginning of a mindset. In other words, when you're trying to control people's language, their speech, written or oral, you're really trying to control their thoughts. And by controlling their thoughts, ultimately, you're trying to control their actions. So the idea that, well, we should be nice to each other and we should be inclusive and we shouldn't use certain words, and I can agree with that to an extent. We shouldn't use the N word. That's a dehumanizing, cruel word, for example. But when you start to take it too far, you very quickly find out that the language police are not much interested in open debate and dialogue and getting to the truth. And so PC back in the 90s was really, I think, the first foundation or the first footing of what we've seen as a nasty decline in academic freedom, for example, and free inquiry, moving towards truth. People like Charles Murray find themselves on the wrong side of that sometimes. I think more recently, Professor Amy Wax at Penn Law has found herself very much on the wrong side of that. And so PC, this attempt to begin to control and police language under the auspices of kindness or inclusivity, of course, has morphed into something much, much more ominous, much broader, which we can call woke. Now, woke is overly broad. I think conservatives use it in a sloppy way. It really is at risks becoming one of George Orwell's meaningless words, which are words that are used as in consciously dishonest ways, was what Orwell said. But I think we can somewhat define woke as this totalizing worldview, this idea that every facet of human existence has to be seen through the lens of critical theory, has to be seen in terms of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever it might be, and that basically our entire reality before, let's say, the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s was retrograde and racist, and thus ought to be discarded. And so we need basically a constant revolution in our thinking. We need to have a new blank slate every 3, 5, 8 years as we come up with new terminology, new categories of identity for human beings. We've seen the explosion of pronouns and impositions on language in the trans area in particular. And so woke is, I think, the natural evil progression of political correctness. And now it's something it's all around us. It's choking us. It's like a noxious cloud. We're slowly becoming the goldfish swimming in the water of woke, where we don't really know. In other words, the goldfish says, well, what's water? Well, water is the cultural milieu in which we all live. And, if you talk to people who grew up in places that really were totalitarian or are, like the former USSR, people who grew up in communist China, they will tell you that this self-editing function reminds them of what it was like to be back home, where people snitched on their neighbors for wrongthink. And I sure as hell hope that we're not heading in that direction in the West, but it appears that we are.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to see something, say something type of attitude, which did come in, especially during the pandemic, and I guess that leads kind of naturally into our next kind of topic, which is political money. You said political money is the root of our economic problems. I can't really disagree with you, but can you, for the audience, just talk about what you mean by political money, and how it is actually hurting us terribly?
Right. Well, I tried to come up with a term that would encompass all the binary terminology that has emerged over the years regarding money. In other words, we talk about sound money versus fiat. We talk about commodity money versus paper money. We talk about hard money versus expansionary money. So we've come up with all these terms to describe what's happened, in particular to the US dollar, but really to all the Western currencies. I would argue even the Swiss franc has fallen in terms of the mindset of the Swiss central bank, which I do follow. I'm very interested in the stocks they buy and some of the other things they've done, because I heard an interesting talk a couple of years ago by Rahim Tahizadegen, excuse my pronunciation, our friend in Austria.
Yep.
About how money used to be a country's calling card. The Swiss franc was the calling card of the Swiss people, and they were rightfully proud of it.
Yep.
And so the policies backing that, the Swiss franc really was as good as gold for many, many years. And I think that's fallen. The US dollar, of course, has not been as good as gold since at least FDR's time. Mm-hmm. And really, there were episodes in US history prior to that, where the U.S. federal government was operating its own bank or expanding to pay for wars, even the Civil War itself. We've always, printed money to pay for wars. So the U.S. dollar hasn't really been as good as gold for much of its history. But what FDR did, and then, of course, all the expansions on that through Bretton Woods, and then ultimately Nixon's actions in the 1970s, all that gave us a form of money which is totally divorced from any commodity backing. And as a result of that, we've started to become confused in our thinking about what money is and what its function is. And as a result of that, since we don't much understand money anymore, we don't much understand interest rates and debt, which are directly related to money. These things have all become combined in our muddled thinking. And so I would say the average young quant in the finance industry, maybe on Wall Street, maybe a central banker. And this might be a young person under 30 or 40 who went to Wharton or Stanford or Cambridge or Oxford, all the right schools. But he or she might really have no real understanding of what money ought to be, other than it's a political tool. In other words, money has just become a tool for governments and central banks. It's become a form of policy. And so I hate the term monetary policy. I've always thought that we should deride that term. We don't need a housing policy. We don't need an energy policy. We don't need an agriculture policy. We don't need a money policy either. Money can take care of itself just fine if governments and central banks would get the hell out of the way, and national treasuries, I might add. We're a long way from that, of course. It's been a long time since we've had market money, but for many, many centuries, market money was silver. The Spanish did some things which made silver lose value. And bimetallism was a real problem, as Mises talked about. And so gold emerged really as the world's global currency. And despite what governments and central banks do, I would argue, and I don't love this, but I think it's true, the world wants one money. The world wants to settle transactions across borders, and the whole world wants Diet Coke. You go anywhere on Earth and you can get a Diet Coke. And so I think money could operate in the same way. And a lot of people argue that Bitcoin ought to be or will be that one money the world wants. But governments are going to fight tooth and nail. Central banks are going to fight tooth and nail to keep their political money something that they can issue at will, whether that's directly on the fiscal side in the form of what we could literally call printing money, although most of it's electronic today, not physical.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Also on the monetary policy side, on the central bank side, which is creating a bank deposits to buy debt. from the issuing government, regardless of who holds that, whether that's held by a bank or whether that's held by a little old lady in her, IRA or whatever it might be. Certainly, our central bank in the United States has proven itself ready to act as a backstop and sop up all that treasury debt, regardless of who holds it, so that on the fiscal side, with a wink and a nod, the treasury can issue lots and lots and lots of debt. And that works great until it doesn't. And it sure feels like we are approaching a day where it's not going to work anymore. And people are going to demand maybe junk bond rates to lend money to Uncle Sam, given how profligate our government is. And these events in the Middle East do not give me much confidence that spending is going to be decreased by Uncle Sam anytime soon.
Yeah, no, it certainly doesn't look like that. It was funny. I talked to our good friend Thorsten Polleit a couple of weeks ago, and he said the exact same thing. The world tends toward one money. It would be great if we just had one currency, and unfortunately, the only country that has any experience of that for the past, I don't know, 70 years now is the United States. But I think that we, as a world, has forgotten what a real bank would look like. What would a full reserve bank look like? What if we got rid of fractional reserve bank? And what can you give us a little idea of what that might actually look like?
Well, it's an interesting concept. Caitlin Long is trying to do a full reserve concept bank for digital assets at her Custodia Bank, which she has managed to get registered and chartered out in Wyoming. So Caitlin is someone I think very interesting, someone to keep an eye on. But in the old-fashioned money sphere, which is mostly digital today, let's not forget, almost what we think of as money in existence, currency, is almost all digital today. If you go to your bank, for example, your bank branch, and say, "Hey, I need 20,000 in cash," well, first they'll say, "Why do you need it?" None of their business. Right. But if you respond correctly and say, "Well, I'm buying a used car," they'll say, "Well, come back tomorrow. We don't have it." So there's not a lot of cash out there. And let me just say as an aside to your listeners, I really recommend everybody get $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 at home in cash, hidden in various spots in your house in a safe or something. Because if there is a crisis, if there is a shutdown of banks and ATMs, a holiday, cash is going to be the immediate thing you want and need to deal with the basics. I still think some cash at home is a really good idea. But what a full reserve bank might look like is very simple. People would actually pay a few points in order to make sure that their physical cash in the old economy could be housed somewhere where it was safe, safer than keeping it in your house, let's say a safe in your home, and you don't want to encourage thievery or burglars. Or in the digital age, full reserve banks could form a security platform. They would have the economies of scale to protect your money digitally from hackers or whatever, some sort of malware attack, whatever that might look like. So whether we're talking about physical cash, or whether we're talking about digital cash, a full reserve bank would simply safeguard and hold your money for you, safe keep it in a way that was always available to you. And yeah, they're going to charge you a little bit for that. But in a full reserve bank, your cash would remain titled in your name. It would be almost like a coat check. When you go to the opera, you take your coat off and you hand the coat check person your coat. They give you a paper ticket. That paper ticket is not, is simply a redemption coupon so that you can go get your jacket, but it's still your jacket. Unfortunately, in the non-full reserve system, which we have across the West, but certainly in the U.S. today, when you make a deposit of your money in the bank, let's say B of A or one of the big national banks, you're actually a creditor at that point. Whether that's a demand deposit or a time deposit, you are effectively a creditor to that bank. And if the bank were to go under, you don't have a right to your money in a bankruptcy or insolvency situation, except as a creditor. It's no longer titled asset in your name. So, most people are not aware of this. And of course, commercial banks lend out on a fractional reserve system. There's many multiples of that. I think in a true market system, there would be demand for full reserve banks. I do think there are lots of people, especially very wealthy people, who would indeed pay a point or two to keep their money safeguarded and know that it was safe. And I do think that in a free market situation, there would also be some degree of fractional reserve banking. I think some banks would say, hey, we're going to pay you a higher rate of interest in exchange for a little bit more risk. That when you want to come get your money out, it might not be there. I don't think it would be anywhere near the kind of levering up we see in the fractional reserve system today, but it might be 5 or 10% or something like that. So I'm not. I think it's a market question whether some degree of free banking would exist in a true market. So I don't really care to argue that. But banks should be warehouses, money warehouses. That's what Murray Rothbard called them, right. And they issue you a ticket, and that ticket is your claim to what back in the day used to be real money, but today, unfortunately, is political money.
Yeah, I love when Rothbard talks about bailments. I didn't even know what that term was until I read him. That's brilliant. Let's turn back to politics for a second. I mean, with everything in such flux right now, not only enough the market seems to be doing just fine, but we've got crazy political tectonic shifts going on at the moment, especially in Middle East. Libertarians and conservatives kind of seem like they're almost trading places. We've got a lot of libertarians go very conservative and go to Israel, get in there. A lot of conservatives kind of went full neocon on this. When people talk to most libertarians nowadays, I think especially the Hoppian school, the bottom school that we kind of attend, we're kind of misconstrued as conservatives. I know I have. I've been called far right. I don't even know what that means. What's the difference to you between libertarians and conservatives? About now.
I'd like to think that there's a lot of differences. But first and foremost, I think on the foreign policy side, non-interventionism is the real America First policy, as far as I'm concerned. The idea that we can or should police the world, and the world is heating up. Russia and Ukraine is no joke. Russia is a nuclear power. Israel is a nuclear power. Israel certainly has the capability to inflict nuclear warfare on many of its neighbors, including Iran, which is not a direct neighbor, but nonetheless. So it's a dangerous time. And I think the idea that the Lindsey Grahams and Nikki Haley's of the world promote is coming back. That's the George W. Bush neoconservative worldview of the early 2000s before disastrous forays, what turned out to be disastrous forays into Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of our bleeding in terms of that $33 trillion in debt that we face today in America was a result of George W. Bush going into Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's not forget, when W entered office in 2001, the entire federal debt was only $5 trillion. I mean, it still could have been dealt with mathematically at that point in terms of some sort of tax hike or benefits cuts to entitlements or spending cuts on defense, selling federal land, whatever, however you might have wanted to deal with it. But at this point, of course, we all know that the federal debt will never be repaid in any meaningful fashion, that we've gone too far around the curve at this point. So there's a big difference between just 20 years ago and today. And I think our U.S. foreign policy is largely to blame. This mindset of neoconservative interventionism. And so it's a jingoistic time in America, of course, both on Ukraine and now Israel, Hamas, Palestine. And I think that ought to be a big division between conservatives and libertarians. I mean, liberty is first and foremost, I think, anti-war. Socialism, communism, collectivism are just a form of domestic warfare. Interventionism is a form of foreign warfare, but I would consider them conceptually very, very similar. The idea that there is a body, a government that has lots of guns and police and tanks and weapons and missiles and bombs, and they ultimately decide what's what, as opposed to the peaceable marketplace, which we would prefer. So I think that's a key difference. I also think conservatives remain wedded to some concepts that probably hinder them politically. The idea of what's the conservative tradition at this point? What's being conserved? It's awfully hard to say. If you're telling me that a conservative is someone who wants to conserve the old political order of the 20th century. Well, no thanks. I have no interest in that political order. The Wilsonian progressive America is of no interest to me. If you tell me that I want to conserve the Habsburg era conception of Europe under an idea of Catholic subsidiarity, then yeah, I'm a little more interested in conserving something like that. But at this point, I think conserve is an incoherent term. We don't know what we're conserving. And while you and I would have a nice definition of liberty as the absence of state coercion, or maybe the absence of the state altogether, even liberty now, if you go ask somebody on the progressive left, what's liberty? They'll give you a very different answer. Go ask someone in China who's come up through Taoism, or Confucianism, what's liberty? They'll give you a very different answer. Go ask a Sunni or a Shia, what's liberty? They'll give you a very different answer. It's not universally accepted, the Rothbardian idea of liberty as the absence of the state, as property, as the principal organizing foundation of society. These are not universalisms as much as we might like them to be. So I think libertarian, like liberal, has become a term that's been so denuded, so misused and abused that it has become one of Orwell's meaningless words. So I'm not really comfortable using that term libertarian these days, because I think it's devoid of substance and meaning, much like conservative.
That's a fair call. And I'm wondering, with these shifts and with these almost, this tribalism that we're seeing now, how do you see that shaping into the 2024 campaign? I mean, we don't know if Joe Biden's going to even run. He says he's going to run. We know Kamala can't run because she'd lose badly to whomever the Republicans would put up. Is it going to be Donald Trump from prison? Like, what is, like, the United States seems to be in disarray from where I'm sitting, 4,000 miles away. What are you seeing?
Boy, I hope it's not Trump and Biden. I think both of them have to go. Trump has outlived his usefulness. I think Donald Trump had to happen, in the sense that the Bush and Clinton crime families had to be stopped. And so I think as a country, we owe him a debt of gratitude for doing that. I don't think he was some deep state plan. I think Donald Trump was just a phenomenon that came along spontaneously, surprised the powers that be. They thought Hillary Clinton would defeat him easily, and they were surprised and shocked and not prepared, and they had no plan B to somehow deny him entry into office under some, whatever pretense. So they kind of let him happen. They're not going to let him happen a second time, whether he's literally in jail, whether it's, their bogus arguments under the 14th Amendment, whatever it is. Donald Trump will not be allowed to enter office in 2025, January. I don't care how many votes he gets, folks. Donald Trump will not be allowed. Okay. And so the question becomes, are they going to stick with Biden? I think they're going to throw him under the bus. I think they're going to realize that this man is decidedly infirm and in really bad shape. And so that means we need a Gavin Newsom or a Michelle Obama, someone more palatable than Kamala Harris. And so I think it's shaping up to be a wild time. I really don't know what will happen on the Republican side. None of them interest me or excite me in any way. I think they're all going to, unfortunately, fall into the neoconservative foreign policy framework because of this war in Israel could be ongoing, could be a long-term thing. We don't yet know. And I think even Vivek Ramaswamy has had to back off, some of his more non-interventionist sentiments. RFK Jr., who's going to run as an independent, has already demonstrated that he is going to say what he has to say regarding the situation in the Middle East. So there's not a clear non-interventionist candidate running for office on the Republican or Democratic ticket. I fear that these geopolitical events, combined with all the inflationary malaise at home, is going to pave the way for someone as awful as a Nikki Haley, someone who's just detached from reality, and thinks that we can spend. And, that's how I see it shaping up. I see a return of neoconservatism on the GOP side. And I think the American first populist right that Trump embodied will be diminished.
It's a fair call. And now, that all comes to pass. The de-dollarization, I mean, we've talked about, the economy and we're kind of trapped in this world right now where the dollar is that one currency we've all worked towards, but now a really good portion of the world doesn't want that dollar anymore. They saw what happened to Russia. They saw those sanctions. They've also seen Russia shake off those sanctions and really just hurt Europe and America more than they've ever hurt Russia. Do you have any opinion on going forward? Is the U.S. going to be able to corral everyone back into the dollar system? We're going to see a BRICS currency emerge, or is it going to be Bitcoin? Do you have any idea on that?
I definitely think in the short term, the US dollar is that one currency the world wants, as political as it is. Doesn't make me happy to say that. I think the dollar has been a tool not only of domestic policy, spending on entitlements, but also of war. It's been a foreign policy tool for the US government to spend wildly beyond what it takes in tax receipts and run huge deficits, because the whole world needs our dollar, and a proxy for holding dollars is holding US treasuries. So it's been a very nice arrangement for us. The dollar world, as Giscard d'Estaing, the French finance minister, called it our exorbitant privilege, and he was damn right. And I think a lot of Americans are asleep at the wheel as to how wealthy we feel as a result of that, of being able to effectively export inflation, versus how productive we really are to deserve that feeling of wealth. So we've had it good for a long time. And I do think that's coming to a natural end. But I don't think it's around the corner. I have to agree with Brent Johnson and his dollar milkshake theory. I think in the short term, all this turmoil is good for the US dollar. I think the euro pales in comparison. Euro's got some real problems. You've got all those sovereign, well, sort of sovereign governments in Europe, which can still issue their own bond debt, but they're under one currency. That was never going to work. In the long term, there had to just be euro bonds and no individual bonds from Greece or Italy or where, whatever issuer it might be. So that was never going to work. The Germans got the short end of that. We all understood that 20, 30 years ago. Philip Bogus wrote about it and explained it so clearly for us in his book, The Tragedy of the Euro. So all that's come to pass. Gold and Bitcoin have a long way to go, and they have some real political headwinds. I mean, there are ways called laws, for example, enforced by police to prevent them from operating as real day-to-day currency. And so, I think in the short term, the dollar remains. I think the BRICS idea is very interesting. It's certainly in all of those countries' long-term best interests to dethrone the dollar. But in a bizarre way, it's not in their short-term best interests, because they themselves hold dollars, most of them, and most of them hold treasuries. Russia, not so much on the treasury side, but all those countries have dollars. And so if there's a precipitous decline in the world's reserve currency, that's going to hurt them as well. So it's musical chairs. Who's going to be able to get rid of their dollars first before this decline? I think it's just untenable. And also, if you look at the central banks' policies in the last 10, 20 years of all those countries, China especially, I mean, there's nothing there to give you confidence that they are prepared, maybe not even on a retail currency level, a gold-backed currency for their actual populations to use day to day, but just an international settlement currency. The gold that would be required to back that, in trade between these nations in the expanding BRICS, it would require an awful lot of trust between the Russians and the Chinese and the Brazilians. I mean, who's going to hold the gold? Is there going to be a central repository, or is it all going to be sort of IOU accounting fiction, but still held within the national borders of those countries? Are they really going to abide by the trades? Are they really going to swap the gold to settle trades, whether that's just in accounting or whether it's physically moving around? Boy, there's an awful lot of trust involved there. And these countries have been profligate in their own spending, especially China. So there's nothing there that makes me believe that these countries are capable of the fiscal discipline which would be required to maintain a gold-backed currency. I mean, it's not, you can create one, you can do the structural mechanics of one, but politically, can you restrain yourself? I mean, gold is a check on government spending, and it's a daunting one, if you're really abiding by the rules of the backing. So I'm not confident that the Brazilians or the Indians or the Chinese have this capability. But it's interesting that you point out the unintended consequence, perhaps unintended, of those sanctions. The ruble's done very well. It's really Germany and Europe that's been hit with the higher utility bills for heat and electricity as they shut down their own nuclear plants and rely increasingly on not only Russian oil, but Ukrainian wheat. Wheat is a pretty important element of an awful lot of foodstuffs. So, the West shot itself in the foot. I think the Russians are winning in a sick way, a grinding, slow victory in Ukraine. And, I think the BRICS concept is mostly smoke and mirrors. It's more light, more heat than light.
Right. Fair enough. That's great. One last thing I want to ask you for our younger viewers. I'll get in trouble if I don't ask you this, and this has to do with the housing market. Again, rates have blown up. And it's made it a lot harder for young people. You've in the past said there's some very good reasons to buy a house, but reasons that are not necessarily financial. Do you think it's smarter to rent now? What are your pros and cons versus buying versus renting? Jimmy Altucher, our great tech writer, he always said, "Don't buy a house, don't buy a house." And how do you feel about that right now? What do you think about it right now?
From a purely financial perspective, yes, don't buy a house. There are plenty of ways to invest money that'll probably grow your wealth faster without all of the taxes, the upkeep, the maintenance, the lack of portability that comes with real estate. And even if it's not real estate that you're living in, talk to landlords, large and small, and they will tell you about the horrors right now of evictions, which is very expensive and time consuming. We had a moratorium on evictions in the United States under the auspices of the CDC, not even the National Housing Authorities, the CDC as an administrative agency without any action by Congress in America, supposedly the free market country compared to some of the more, socially democrat European countries. America had a rent moratorium and a mortgage interest moratorium. So much for the free market. You go and own housing and you're planning on rental income, whether that's a tenant or Airbnb or whatever. And all of a sudden, Uncle Sam comes along and tells you that there's a rent moratorium for 2 years because of COVID. You might wish you had put all that money into some Vanguard index fund at that point, right? And let's not forget, the U.S. stock markets had record gains in the first half of 2023. Right. So, you have to invest with your mind and not your ideology. And I think in general, housing is a bad investment for most people, especially younger people. But that's a very generalized statement. There are non-economic reasons. If you are getting married, if you want to have children, if you want to have that stability of a place. But here's the rub. You have to be willing to move out of the Seattles, the San Franciscos, the New York, New Jerseys, the Chicagos, Dallas, Fort Worth, the Orlandos, the Tampas, the Miamis. You have to be willing to go out into the heartland, into the middle of Indiana, into the middle of Nebraska, Oklahoma, places like I live in the college town of Auburn, Alabama, which is becoming somewhat gentrified, but still not too far from me. In parts of Alabama, there are perfectly serviceable homes you can purchase for under $150,000. It's not the fancy kind of home you might want. It's not in the area you might want, but work from home and working digitally is so much more of a phenomenon now. There's so many more opportunities to work from wherever. Eastern Europe, places like Lithuania. Vilnius is a really cool town. There's all kinds of places where you might work abroad if you're able to. So the idea that you buy a house and, well, does that mean in Southern California where, even a crappy ranch home built in the 40s or 50s is going to be $1 million? Okay. Let's say you and you have a husband or wife. Let's say together you make $250,000, $300,000. Well, that's nice, but you're going to have to put $200,000 down to have a rational mortgage, 20% on $1 million home, which is going to be no great shakes. That's not going to be in Newport Beach. That's going to be in an older part of Anaheim or Fullerton or someplace like that, and it's going to be a pretty modest home for $1 million. So you have to put $200,000 down, and then you're borrowing $800,000, which is maybe 4x your annual income, which is at the outside of what you want to borrow. You really don't want to borrow more than 3x your annual income. Mm-hmm. And then you have to start to say, well, what if one of us loses our job? All of a sudden, our annual income is 100 or 150. Then your mortgage starts to look unreasonable. So what you really want to do is, as a younger person, be willing to consider those icky places in red America, and you might find there's some real good people and some real good barbecue and some real good bargains to be had if you're willing to live in places in the Midwest and the South, where everybody else hasn't flocked to it. And, there's some risk involved. I know a guy who's involved in some townhomes in Mississippi, and they're in the capital city there in Mississippi. And, it's a little rough. It's a rough town, and there's a lot of crime there. And he bought 5 townhouses in an old row home for $25,000 each. So $125,000 total. They need a lot of work. He's living in one of them. He's going to fix up and rent the others. And, he's taken some risk. Where he bought these is kind of on the edge of a rough neighborhood. But, it might go the other way. It might gentrify a bit. And he'll have a place to live. And regardless, his monthly note, I assume, on $125,000, maybe $100,000 borrowed, is quite reasonable, maybe $1,000, $1,500, something like that. And he's making a go of it in Jackson, Mississippi, and taking a little bit of a risk. Our baby boomers took those risks in places like the Village in New York, which was rough. There were parts of New Jersey which were very rough, which are now fancy and expensive, and hedge fund guys live there. But there was a time 20, 30 years ago where if you took a risk and maybe bought some dilapidated condos in some of those parts of New Jersey, you're probably pretty well off today. And so, I do feel for young people. I hate this bifurcation between older settled people who have their house at a reasonable price and at a very low interest rate, people like me, versus younger people who have to pay, twice as much and 3 times as high of an interest rate. So the monthly payment triples. That's wrong. That causes a lot of intergenerational strife. I think yes. baby boomers deserve a lot of the ire directed at them. And that's not a healthy thing for our country. However, if you dial things back, you look at history, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, the Great Depression, a couple of world wars. I mean, we still have it pretty darn good. And, as opposed to our immigrant forebears who came to America often with no money in their pocket, didn't speak English, lived with relatives, worked, 3-4 jobs that were manual labor, taking a risk on some condos in a rough part of Jackson, Mississippi pales in comparison to what they did. So let's put it in perspective and let's get going.
Oh, that's excellent advice. I'm taking it myself, just in a different country. But wonderful. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today. What a fantastic conversation. Everybody, follow Jeff on Twitter. He's at Jeff Deist. He's the author of Estranged Liberty, former president of Mises at Monetary Metals now. And if you want level-headed commentary, definitely seek Jeff out. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you, Sean.